part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. My name is Ben Billman and I will be your host. I really appreciate you tuning in for this episode. For the first half, we're going to take a look at what's going on in the world of college basketball, especially what happened last weekend in college basketball. And in the second half, I'm going to take a look at the top 10 best national champions from the last 23 years, or to put it easier, the 21st century. So it's going to be a lot of fun on this episode. I hope you stick around for the whole thing. But let's get into the first half. And what I want to do, if you remember in my last episode, is I listed out a handful of games for you to keep an eye on. Last weekend was really the last big weekend for non-conference play, and we had some amazing matchups. This last weekend did not disappoint when it came to the competition. We are now in the process of transitioning into conference play. And so that's going to bring a whole different look and feel to the season. In the next couple podcasts, I will get more into that. But before we do that, I want to look at what happened over the last week in college basketball. First of all, last Friday, there was a big matchup between Connecticut and Gonzaga. Now, I felt at the time, and I still feel this way, that Gonzaga needed to win this game if they were going to have any argument for a number one seed in the NCAA tournament. Connecticut won this game 76-63. And in my opinion, that probably knocks Gonzaga out of the number one consideration. Even if they swept through the West Coast Conference, which is not beyond them, I just don't think they have enough quality wins at this point to get to that level. On the other hand, Connecticut is absolutely in the hunt for a number one seed. The win over Gonzaga solidified that. And they are still the class of the Big East going into conference play. So keep an eye on Connecticut. I think they're going to be in number one contention all year, and they're definitely the team to beat in the Big East. A couple games that happened on Saturday. Again, it was an unbelievable day of basketball. Lots that happened. First of all, the biggest game of the weekend, Arizona versus Purdue, the number one versus number three teams in the country. And I said last week, and I hold by it, that the winner of that game would be considered the number one team going into conference play. And I stick by that. Purdue won by 8 over Arizona. Now, it may not seem like necessarily fair. This game was played on a neutral court, but it was played in Indianapolis, only about an hour to an hour and a half away from Purdue's campus. So it was neutral, but I think Purdue probably had the home court advantage in this game. But still, Purdue won that game, and because of that, they are the new number one team in the country, which is where they should be. And Arizona, again, like I talked about with Connecticut, Arizona should still be the class of the Pac-12. I have no doubts that Arizona will control their destiny when it comes to being a number one seed, and they've got the talent. They've proven it all year. Purdue being their first loss, it wouldn't surprise me if they get to the upper 20s as far as wins in the regular season and storm through the Pac-12. Another big game, Kansas versus Indiana. Indiana led almost the whole game against Kansas until the last few minutes when the Jayhawks showed the ability to come back, take the lead, and Hunter Dickinson, like he did at Michigan many times, took over, and at the end of the game, Kansas won by 4. What this means for Kansas, it's a quality win on the road going into Big 12 play. They should be at the top of the heap in the Big 12, but there are so many good teams. A win like this helps a lot when it comes to entering Big 12 play. For Indiana, this was a heartbreaker and a big-time loss when it came to winning a huge game at home to bolster their non-conference strength of schedule and overall record. It's very interesting, though, when I look at the Big Ten, outside of Purdue, Illinois, and to an extent Wisconsin, I have really no idea below that what's going to happen in the conference. So even though Indiana has not looked great in the non-conference, don't count them out just yet, because there is a wide open door for that 4, 5, 6, 7 range in the Big Ten, and I think Indiana will be there for most of the season. One of the other big games this weekend, Houston, who was number 4 going into the game against Texas A&M. Now, the SEC, again, needed every win that they could get because of the struggles they've had in recent weeks. Well, unfortunately for A&M, they lose this game, which is really unfortunate because this would have been a huge win for them heading into SEC play. On the other hand, when we look at Houston and we talk about Kansas as well, it was a big win for them. But the key, and unfortunately, Houston, even with the win, overall, this might come back to haunt them. That Terrence Arsenault, a sophomore guard on the team who plays a big role, is more of a role player, but is in the rotation on a regular, daily, every night type of situation, was injured and is out for the year. That doesn't mean that Houston is absolutely done, but it was a key cog to their team that is now out for the rest of the year. So we'll keep an eye on that as they enter into Big 12 play. The shock of the weekend was Baylor versus Michigan State. I don't think I've ever seen a team as desperate for a win as Michigan State, who then turned on the Jets and actually matched the desperation. Michigan State ended up winning by 24 points, absolutely destroying a Baylor team who I thought looked like one of the national title contenders before this game. It doesn't mean that Baylor is absolutely cooked for the year, but heading into Big 12 play, when you have Kansas playing so well, when you have Houston playing so well, a couple other teams, it's a big question mark with Baylor now. And like I just mentioned with Indiana, now Michigan State, can they get the ball rolling a little bit? Can this be the beginning of a new season, a new chapter for them as they head into Big Ten play? Creighton beat Alabama. Again, another one the SEC absolutely needed to strengthen their argument for higher seeds in the NCAA tournament. But Creighton pulled it out 85-82. Creighton will continue to be a team to keep an eye on when it comes to the Big East. The second biggest game of the weekend, in my opinion, was North Carolina versus Kentucky. If you missed this game, you missed a classic. Lots of big plays, lots of big names. And these two teams, I have no doubt, are going to be there late into March. In this game, though, Kentucky, a very young Kentucky team, beat a very experienced North Carolina team 87-83. I think what I took away from this game is that Kentucky, as of right now, is the favorite in the Southeastern Conference. I think you could argue Tennessee is there, but I will give Kentucky a little bit of edge because of the way they handle North Carolina. And on the other side, the meaning behind this game for North Carolina is that they should not be afraid going into ACC play. The ACC overall has struggled all year. I think North Carolina has to look at it and say, This is our year, after not making the tournament last year, to get back, make the NCAA tournament, and be a top seed and win the ACC. I would not be worried if I were them, even with the loss to Kentucky. Tennessee had a tough game against North Carolina State, but pulled it out. For Tennessee, after the 3-game losing streak earlier this year, they have gotten back on the line, and they are in top shape heading into conference play. So I put Kentucky and Tennessee right up there at the top. Texas beat LSU, another game I talked about last week. Big win for Texas. Biggest question for them is, what are they going to have entering into Big 12 play? They're a team that's going to have to grit it out almost every single night in the Big 12, and that's going to be very difficult. So the new top 25 dropped on Monday after a great weekend of basketball, and here's where we stand with some of the risers and some of the fallers. First of all, Purdue is back at number 1 after beating Arizona. Arizona dropped all the way to number 4. So at the top we have Purdue, Kansas, Houston, Arizona, and Connecticut. I agree with those top 5, and in that order, I think it's fair to have those 5 there. Again, the question with Houston is, now with this injury to Arsenault, how do they fix that rotation and get back on track? Some of the other big risers over the weekend, teams to keep an eye on. At number 7, Oklahoma, one of just a handful of undefeated teams that are left in college basketball. Keep an eye on Oklahoma entering into Big 12 play. They look really good. Porter Moser is their coach, and you might remember when he was the coach at Loyola Chicago, taking that team all the way to the Final Four. Now he's at Oklahoma, and it looks like he's building a really good team there. At number 8, Tennessee, like I mentioned, they are back on track. I don't know if they deserve to be in the number 1 seed conversation right now, but number 2 or number 3, absolutely. We already talked about Kentucky, who's up to number 9. I think Tennessee and Kentucky are almost interchangeable at this point. Baylor fell 4 spots to number 10. Again, that loss to Michigan State was very, very difficult, and this raises a lot of questions for them heading into the Big 12. UNC fell slightly, as did Creighton. Even though Creighton did beat Alabama, they had lost earlier in the week to UNLV, and so that's why they dropped. Illinois at 13 and Wisconsin at 24. Those are the 2 teams to keep an eye on in the Big 10. Other than Purdue, can those 2 teams challenge Purdue for a Big 10 title? Gonzaga fell all the way to 15th. And again, I think they're out of the number 1 seed consideration, even if they were to win out. Somehow, it just doesn't look like they have the amount of wins they need. Also, Clemson, which I talked about last week, they lost their first game of the year, and so they dropped all the way to 18th. The ACC, though, other than North Carolina and to an extent Duke, man, it is wide open right now. Miami, Florida looks shaky. Virginia looks very shaky. So this might still be the year Clemson has a chance to finish up there in the top 2 or 3. If we're looking at mid-majors right now, the team at the top of that heap would have to be James Madison. James Madison, 10-0, and they look like the team that is going to be at the top of the mid-major rankings maybe all season. They sit at number 20 in the rankings, and to me, they look like a team that is probably going to be in the top 25 till March. And maybe the most surprising team, or the team that had the least amount of expectations this year from a power conference that looks like they are going to be a formidable foe, is Mississippi. Chris Beard, who you might remember from Texas Tech, taking Tech all the way to the national championship game in 2019, and then getting fired last year from Texas, now is at Mississippi. And unbelievably, he has Mississippi at 10-0, number 25 in the rankings, and they are a scary team going into conference play in the SEC. Chris Beard is not a coach that you want to mess around with. He can do some pretty special things at programs very quickly, and he slowly but surely has Mississippi in the top 25 and a team that is very gritty, like their coach, and is going to be a tough out in SEC play and in March. Couple games this week to keep an eye on. Again, as we near Christmas, we start to see some easier games for some of the bigger teams as they get set for their break, for Christmas break, but then also entering into this conference schedule. There are some big games coming up, though, as we hit conference play. The Big East is already in conference play. Butler got a big win over Georgetown. We've got games with Connecticut and Seton Hall, and Villanova Creighton. So the Big East is off and running already. Another big game coming up is Baylor versus Duke, a Big 12 versus ACC matchup. Two teams with a lot of question marks. Can Baylor recover after that loss to Michigan State? And can Duke start to rebound after a slow start to the season heading into ACC play? We already talked about Oklahoma and North Carolina. Those two teams are playing as well. There should be a lot of fanfare around that game, and I think the winner of that game has to feel very good going into conference play. Also, Arizona and Alabama is another big game. Alabama, after securing the number 1 overall seed in last year's NCAA tournament, has taken a huge step back. And Arizona, how are they going to look after coming off a close loss, but yet a loss to Purdue last week? Can Arizona get turned back around and get back on track after that loss to Purdue? So those are some good games coming up. A few others to keep an eye on. One of the biggest rivalries in all of college basketball, Kentucky and Louisville. The Bluegrass in-state competition happens every year. That's coming up this week as well on Thursday night. Louisville has looked absolutely terrible last year and so far this year. This is almost a must-win game for Kentucky if they want to have any hopes of a number 1 seed or going to the SEC with any momentum whatsoever. A loss to Louisville would absolutely crush any momentum that they have after that win over North Carolina. Again, the Big East continues to get going with Georgetown and Marquette on Friday. And then one of the other big rivalries takes place on Friday as well, with the border war between Illinois and Missouri. Missouri has struggled as of recently, and so they really need to get this win over Illinois if they're going to enter the SEC play with any confidence whatsoever. And then the last big game that I want to talk about, and one to keep an eye on Saturday of this week, is Arizona versus Florida Atlantic. If there's a game that could alter Florida Atlantic's season, it would be this one. With a win over Arizona, they're going to enter into conference play with a real chance to get maybe a 2 or a 3 seed. Arizona's going to be a top 5 team almost all year, and so a win over them would push Florida Atlantic back into the top 10 and more than likely getting a top 3 or 4 seed come March. So that is a big game for them. And for Arizona on the other side, as they're about the only team in the Pac-12 that has anything going this season, they really need to win this game to secure their spot and keep it top of the Pac-12 standings. So those are some games to keep an eye on. I'm really excited for Christmas and being able to sit back and watch some basketball, and then also start to develop an idea of what's going to happen once these teams enter conference play. All right, let's take a quick break. for some commercials, and we will come back with the second half.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
What's up, everyone? I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Tybus Powell.
And we are your hosts of the Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need to get you through the regular season, hopeful postseason, and I'd say off-season, Tybus, but is there really ever an off-season for this team?
Thankfully for our podcast, Holly, there really never is when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Don't miss our breakdown of each week's matchup, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
Yes, they do. So hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger, Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast for the second half. Now, for the second half this week, what I want to do is look at the 10 best national champions from the 21st century in college basketball. So a couple factors to think about before we get into this list. First of all, I have eliminated the 2013 Louisville Cardinals from this list because that championship was vacated due to program violations that took place. So I will not be including the 2013 Louisville Cardinals in this list. And unfortunately, because COVID canceled the 2020 season, we'll never know who actually won the national championship in 2020. So I'm not going to include a team from 2020, try to create an imaginary national champion or anything like that. So outside of those two, from the year 2000 up until last year, 2023, those are the teams I'm going to be looking at, and I'm going to rank the best national champions, starting with number 10, working all my way up to the best team, the best champion of the 21st century. Another note before I start is that there are a couple teams out there that did not win the national championship, but probably should still be on the top 10 teams of the 21st century without that title run. Well, don't worry about that, because next week I will be doing the 10 best teams of the 21st century that did not win the national championship. So that will be coming up next week. So that should be a fun list as well. All right, well, let's start with number 10 on the best championship teams from the 21st century. At number 10, I have the 2001-2002 Maryland Terrapins. This team at this point was still in the ACC. They finished 32-4 overall. They only lost one game in conference play. They entered the NCAA tournament as a number 1 seed, and they were loaded with a lot of talent. They beat Kansas and then in the Final Four, and then Indiana in the national championship. Some names that you might recognize on this roster: Juan Dixon, who also played in the NBA, Lonnie Baxter, Chris Wilcox, and Steve Blake. Those were really the core four of this team. The year before, they made it to the Final Four, but lost to Duke in a heartbreaker after having a huge lead in the semifinals the year before. And so now they finally get redemption, and in 2002, they win the national championship, and they are number 10 on my list of the best champions of the 21st century. Number 9 on my list, they kicked off the 21st century with the first championship in 2000, and that is the 1999-2000 Michigan State Spartans. And it's crazy to think that this is actually the last Big Ten team to have won a national championship. Tom Izzo, fairly young in his career as the coach of the Spartans, They were not the most spectacular team in the regular season. They had 7 losses entering into the tournament, but still, this team finished 32-7, 13-3 in conference play, and they had multiple stars on this team. The most famous nickname for their players was the Flintstones because of all the players they had from Flint, Michigan that played on this team. Some of the more recognizable names would be Morris Peterson, Charlie Bell, Jason Richardson, who had a long NBA career. But the most important name and one of the biggest names in the history of college basketball has to be Mateen Cleaves. The point guard, the leader. He got injured in the national championship game against Florida, but came back after twisting his ankle and led the Spartans to the national championship. A really impressive team, and again, hopefully at some point, maybe this year, the Big Ten can finally end their drought of not having a national champion. So Michigan State, the 2000 national champs, at number 9 on my list. At number 8, the 06-07 Florida Gators. This is a team that repeat as national champions after winning the 06 national championship. All the starters came back, and they repeated in 07. They were 35-5. They won the SEC. Billy Donovan was a great coach at Florida. Unfortunately, he moved up to the NBA, which is still disappointing. I think he should have stayed at Florida. But anyways, this team was loaded with talent, and one of the rare times that top talent has decided to come back after winning to try to repeat. Al Horford, Corey Brewer, Joakim Noah. Those are the big 3 on this team. But Taurean Green, Lee Humphrey, those are other guys that played and were in the starting lineup. To have 2 teams in a row, both with the same starting lineups. The 07 team, though, more experienced, more talented, and scarier when it came to March. They beat a very formidable Ohio State with Greg Oden and Mike Conley in the national championship. And so they sit on my list at number 8. At number 7, again, the best teams to win a national championship in the 21st century, I have the 2018-2019 Virginia Cavaliers. In the 2018 NCAA tournament, Virginia became the first number 1 seed ever to lose to a 16 seed when they lost to UMBC. Well, they came back the next year. They were again a number 1 seed, and this year they went all the way and won the national championship. It wasn't without its difficulties and controversies, though. In the Elite Eight, it took a buzzer beater to send it to overtime against Purdue. In the Final Four, it took a controversial 3-point foul to take over the lead when Kyle Guy went to the line to win that game. And in the national championship, it took a corner 3 in the closing seconds by DeAndre Hunter to send that game into overtime. So you talk about nail-biting for the Virginia Cavaliers to win a championship, but they were able to complete it. They had an amazing team, like I mentioned, with Kyle Guy and DeAndre Hunter, but they also had key players like Ty Jerome, Mamadi Diakite, Braxton Key, Jay Huff, and Kihei Clark, all players in that rotation that mattered a lot. Tony Bennett got a championship and proved that his system, which is defense first, can win at the highest level. So I have the 2019 Virginia Cavaliers at number 7. At number 6, I have the 2020-2021 Baylor Bears. This was Scott Drew forming a team over a decade or so when the program was in absolute chaos. To bring this team to national championship level was pretty incredible. You might remember this tournament being pretty crazy because we were still in COVID. No fans were allowed to attend these games for the most part. But even with all the uncertainty and chaos going on, Baylor rampaged through this tournament. The championship game included a Gonzaga team which entered the game undefeated. And so for Baylor in the championship to take down an undefeated team is pretty special. The two players that stuck out on this team, Jared Butler, first of all, and then also Davion Mitchell, who is making a name for himself in the NBA. This team finished 28-2, but they very well could have finished undefeated if not for a couple midseason injuries which benched some of their key players in the middle of the season. If they had gone undefeated, this team might be at the top of this list or near the top of this list. So I have the Baylor Bears at number 6. At number 5, the 2004-2005 North Carolina Tar Heels. The Tar Heels right there were a dominant force throughout the season. They finished 33-4. They won the ACC. And the names of this team are pretty recognizable in the history of college basketball. Sean May, Rashad McCants, Raymond Felton, Marvin Williams, all players that went on to the NBA and had success. But the thing to remember about this team is that the championship game, they took on an Illinois team that was absolutely loaded that year. One of the best national championship games I can remember, North Carolina versus Illinois. And it was a great game. Roy Williams, just a couple years ago, had come over from Kansas back to his alma mater of North Carolina. This was his first national championship back with the Tar Heels. He would go on to win a couple more, but this was the beginning of a new dynasty at North Carolina, and they beat Illinois in a very close but very competitive national championship game in 2005. Okay, moving on to the top 4. So if I was going to create a final 4 of the best championship teams from the 21st century, these would all be number 1 seeds. If I had a bracket, this would be the 4th number 1 seed in that bracket, and that would be the 2011-2012 Kentucky Wildcats. We think about the one-and-done era of college basketball and the impact that it has had on the game overall. And the team that first comes to mind when I think about the one-and-done era is the 2012 Kentucky Wildcats team. They went 38-2 on the season, absolutely dominated their way through the NCAA tournament, and took down a pretty good Kansas team in the national championship. The thing to look at with this roster is just how many freshmen contributed when it came to their tournament run. The name at the top of that list is Anthony Davis, the 7-footer who didn't score a whole lot in the national championship, but affected the game with rebounds and blocks to the point that he won Player of the Year, or MOP, without being the leading scorer on that team. Other freshmen who played a big role on that team include Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, Marquise Teague, and Kyle Wiltshire. The thing that John Calipari had on this team was the one-and-done type players, but he also mixed it perfectly with a couple guys with experience that had a lot of playing time going into this season at Kentucky, including Deron Lamb, Terrence Jones, and Darius Miller. So looking back at the John Calipari era, and I know it's not over yet, but this team had what I consider the perfect blend of one-and-done talent and experience that for whatever reason he has not been able to duplicate at Kentucky since then. Now, next week when we look at the best teams of all of the 21st century to not win a national championship, there will be a Kentucky team on there that was almost able to replicate what the 2012 team did, but we'll talk about that more next week. Number 3 on the list of the best championship teams from the 21st century in college basketball, I've got the 2017-2018 Villanova Wildcats. Jay Wright wins his second title in 3 years at Villanova. In 2016, Chris Jenkins hits the buzzer beater to win the national championship. In 2018, it's not even close. They ran away with this championship and had so much talent on this team, it's almost unfair. When you look at the current state of NBA basketball, some of the biggest names, some of the biggest talent and biggest stars were on this 2018 Villanova team, including Jalen Brunson, Mikal Bridges, Dante DiVincenzo, Amari Spellman, Eric Pascal, Colin Gillespie, Jermaine Samuels. In the one-and-done era, Jay Wright flipped the script and took one of the most experienced teams in the country over the last 23 years and brought it all the way to a national championship. They beat Michigan in the championship, and it really wasn't close. Dante DiVincenzo had the game of his life, and to include all the shooters they had on this team, it was almost unfair that year in college basketball to have such a talented team. So I have Villanova, the 2018 Villanova Wildcats, at number 3. All right, we're into the top 2 teams in the 21st century who won a championship. Number 2 on my list is the 2007-2008 Kansas Jayhawks. Bill Self finally gets over the hump and wins his first national championship at Kansas, but it came on a desperation 3 in regulation to tie the game by Mario Chalmers to send the game into overtime against Memphis and finally get the win. This would have been a very controversial championship if Memphis would have won because of the restrictions and violations that Memphis had. So I'm kind of glad that Kansas ended up winning this game so that we didn't have to take away and revoke a championship from Memphis. But Kansas this year finished 37-3. Again, Bill Self gets his first championship at Kansas, and they were loaded with NBA talent as well. Like I already mentioned with Mario Chalmers, but they also had Darrell Arthur, Brandon Rush, Darnell Jackson, Sharon Collins, Cole Aldrich. Again, a team that was loaded with NBA-level talent. It took a wild three-pointer by Mario Chalmers to get it to overtime in the championship, but they did end up winning. One of the also more memorable games that occurred during their championship run was in the Elite Eight when they took out Steph Curry and the Davidson Wildcats in one of the classic games that year as well. All right, we've worked all the way up to the best national championship team of the 21st century. And we have to go all the way back to the start of the 21st century for this team. And that would be the 2000-2001 Duke Blue Devils. I don't think it's any surprise for those of you that follow college basketball to know that this team was absolutely loaded. Mike Krzyzewski, after about a decade of not winning, returns to the top of the college basketball world and does it in impressive fashion. Now, Duke had a couple teams in the late 90s that were clearly the best team in the country, but for some reason, one way or another, they were not able to capitalize on that and win a championship. But in 2000 and 2001, it all came together at the right time, and Mike Krzyzewski got a title that he deserved with one of the best rosters in college basketball history. Jay Williams at point guard, Shane Battier, Mike Dunleavy, Carlos Boozer, Chris Duhon, all names that not just synonymous with college basketball success, but also NBA success. It was an incredible team, very experienced, and a team that could have easily won in 2002 as well. Could have repeated, but lost to Indiana in the Sweet 16. Mike Krzyzewski, this team finished 35-4. One of the most miraculous moments for this team occurred in the Final Four when they played in conference foe Maryland, went down by over 20 points in the first half, and came back to win. They then went on to play Arizona in the national championship, another team that was very talented, and took them down by double digits. So I have the 2001 Duke Blue Devils as the best championship team of the 21st century. So let me know if you agree with my list. Let me know if there's any teams that I ranked wrong, or if there's any teams that I left off that you think should have been in the top 10. But that is my list, and I really appreciate you listening to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast. I will be back next week with an update of what's going on in the world of college basketball, and then also we'll explore the best teams of the 21st century that did not win a national championship. So think about that and have your list ready so you can compare it to my list next week on the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast. You all have a good week, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.